Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So I interviewed a very smart gentleman a couple of months ago, Ioannis Prasas. Is that correct, Ioannis?
That's correct. I know it sounds Greek to you, but that's correct.
It does sound Greek to me. Who is a staff scientist at Mount Sinai Hospital, about some work that they were doing on some COVID-19 testing. And I've recently seen that they got some very positive results. And so I wanted to check back in and find out what's going on. So Ioannis, how are you? Welcome to my show.
I'm very well, Brian, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back here after a few months. And I remember at the last time we spoke, I told you that in the beginning of the next year, we're going to have some good news about some new tests that we were cooking in the lab. And I think that this is where we are now, and I'm happy to discuss about this today.
So tell me, what's the results that you recently announced?
So what we have been working on, and this is something that we have been working in collaboration with a company called Mesoscale Discovery from the States. We're developing the first ultra-sensitive saliva-based antigen detection assay for coronavirus. So what does this mean? It means that we have developed a fully saliva-based assay that can detect very, very low amounts of viral antigens in saliva, on par with classic PCR, the molecular testing.
So I understand one of the problems with the PCR test is that it may not actually get a positive until a little bit of time in the infection has passed. Do you get a positive more quickly?
That's something that actually we are now running. We are trying to identify the kinetics of the antigen expression in saliva, head-to-head comparing our own assay with PCR. I think that the biggest problem with PCR is not so much how early it would catch a positive case. The problems with PCR have to do with, for example, a delay in the reporting time. We know that sometimes you can get your results back in 1 or 2 days. So this is a long turnaround time, and our assay can bring results much faster. And another actually problem of PCR is that because it involves this amplification stage, we now know that PCR can be positive for much longer compared to what is the true infectious period of a patient. For example, we know that a PCR positive test can come even after 25 days post-symptom onset. However, we know that infectivity is mostly concerning the first week or 10 days post-symptom onset. So what we are now trying to prove is that the expression kinetics of the antigen in the saliva is shorter, and this allows a much better definition of the infectiousness comparing the positivity of our assay compared to the classic PCR assay.
So this is really interesting. So are you telling me that someone could have the infection in their nasal cavity, do the PCR test positive, but no longer infectious because it's past the 25 day time period?
Yes, this is correct. This is correct. And this is something that we know. That's a caveat that's why we say that sometimes too much sensitivity could be a problem. I know that this has been used by several people, that they try to hit the whole knowledge about the importance of testing, but we have to be careful here. What we say is that exactly what you said, Brian. If there is, let's imagine that there is a crime happening. Now, there may be DNA left in the room, but the criminal is now gone. So PCR, if it comes positive, we cannot know for sure if it does identify the criminal or the remnants of the DNA that is left behind, even though the criminal is gone. We believe that our test would be better than PCR in giving you more confidence that what you see as a signal is the presence of the criminal and not just something that was there when the criminal was there.
That's fascinating. And it's an interesting analogy. So
it's
why
not
would the virus?
It's not my analogy for sure. It is something that Dr. Mina is using left and right. And I like this analogy because it helps people conceptualize what is the difference between the infectivity period versus the positivity period.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But why would the infection still be in the nasal cavity and not be in the saliva?
Well, this has to do with two things. The differences between the nasal cavity and saliva in terms of where is this fluids coming from. And the second thing, it has to do with the technology that you use to measure them. For example, we know that in the PCR tests, there is this amplification step that can really take even a tiny remnant of the DNA, of the RNA of the virus, and it can amplify it until you get a signal. So this is something that can actually give you this confusing data regarding the infectivity or not. And that's why there is now a lot of discussion in the clinics about what is the threshold of positivity in a PCR test that should be considered as a true active infectious status of a sample. As you may know, Brian, we are using these CT cycles, which is the number of cycles that the PCR machine is using in order to identify the virus in the swab extract. And there is a lot of discussion. Should we use a threshold of 25? Should we use a threshold of 30? Should we use a threshold of 32, 33, or 35, or even 40? So this is quite ambiguous, and the presence of this amplification step can actually make this discussion even more difficult than what it really is.
So I apologize. Explain to me what this 25, 30, 32 is. What is that?
Let me explain this, how PCR works. There is an amplification step, and every time the machine is trying to identify the virus, it actually goes deeper and deeper and deeper. So the more cycles that you need in order to identify remnants of the nucleic acid of the virus, what PCR measures, then it means that the less amount of the virus is there, because you need to dig very deep in order to find some little remnants. Now, it is very difficult to define what is exactly the depth of the PCR test that needs to be set in order to define that, yes, this is enough presence of the virus to call this a true positive infectious sample.
Fascinating.
So there is a lot of discussion about this. And we believe also that the saliva is also closer to the whole sense of infectivity, because we believe that most of the infections actually happen through aerosol transmission that happens when we speak, when we cough, when we sneeze, that is mostly coming from our mouth. It doesn't mean that it cannot come from our nose, but it's mostly coming from our mouth. That's why we believe that in general, saliva correlates would associate better with the infectivity status compared to the nasal.
Well, and I presume two of the other big benefits are, number one, less discomfort in taking the test, and then do you get the results more quickly? How do you get the results?
Let me actually do the comparison. So as you said it, swabbing, which is now the classic way, the established way for molecular PCR-based testing, it is something that has several caveats. The first thing is that it is uncomfortable. It's invasive. Sometimes it can be painful. I've seen people complaining that I feel like it touches my brain. I know that certain people, like kids, hate it. And in general, it is also more risky. And when I say more risky, is that because it cannot be sampling, it is not suitable for self-sampling, you need to have a trained person that would do this to you, and this entails a risk of transmitting the disease to the trained person.
Well, I got to tell you, I've had, I think, 3 COVID tests, and one time I hardly felt it at all, and was worried they didn't go in far enough. And the other time, oh my gosh, that hurt. So, like different people apply it very differently.
That's very true. And actually, this happens to me too. Most of the times, I should admit I had no problem. Sometimes I get a bit of an irritation. Personally, I'm willing to take any irritation, but I know many people, actually, this is...
I'm willing to take it. I'm just commenting that it was very different in the 2 applications.
Absolutely. And Brian, there are many people that are really not willing to take it. And for many people, this is a reason not to comply with the frequency of testing that eventually is going to be requested in order to control as society the spread of this disease and block the large transmission chains. Now,
Hold on a second. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Ioannis Prasas and discuss how we actually get the results and what the process is, what the timing is, and how, whether they're false positives, false negatives, what the efficacy is. Stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on 2nd and 60. We're chatting tonight with Ioannis Prasas, who is a staff scientist at Mount Sinai Hospital. He's been there for the last almost 5 years. Before that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Simon Lunenfeld Research Institute. Before that, he got his PhD at the University of Toronto. And before that, he was a summer intern at the Max Planck Institute of Molecular Cell Biology and Genetics in Dresden. And he got his Bachelor of Science at Democritus University of Thrace. Is that pronounced it all right?
That's correct. Actually, it's Democritus University of Thrace in Greece. That's correct.
Sounds like an interesting university. I'd love to hear more about that. And he's obviously an expert in molecular biology, drug discovery, and proteomics. And so lots of different topics we could talk about. But for the last little while, he's been really focused on testing for COVID-19. And we've just been talking about this new swab test. And so, Ioannis, tell me, what do? You just take like a toothpick or like a popsicle stick and take a swab off your tongue?
No, there's no swabbing there. You just literally spit. You just drew into a specific tube it's a special tube that allows the easy collection of saliva, and you just need a tiny amount of your saliva, and that's it. There's no swabbing. There's no scratching. There's nothing. It's something that everybody can do very easily.
And then how do you test it? Is it like the pool chemical test that you can just dip a little stick in, or do you have to send it away to a lab?
Actually, this is a little more complicated. And here, before I describe how it works, I would like to separate this with what most people bring in their minds when they hear about an antigen test. So far, most of the antigen tests, when someone says antigen test, it refers to these lateral flow assays, very similar to what it is, for example, the glucose test for diabetes or the pregnancy test. And these tests are great. I'm a big proponent of the use of these lateral flow, very easy, in theory, very cheap tests. We do not have them, unfortunately, yet. And parentheses, I'm personally very frustrated that we have really seen so much delays into bringing this in massive use. But we need to remember what is the intended use and what is the question that you want to answer with the different tests. For example, these lateral flow assays, these pregnancy-like tests, are excellent tools in terms of a public health perspective. So if you really want to understand how much spread there is in your society, you can afford to lose individual cases, because these tests, even if they have suboptimal sensitivities, they are going to capture quite a lot, maybe the majority of those people that they have a significant amount of virus in their saliva and above. Of course, the problem with these lateral flow assays is that they will miss cases in which the viral load is there, but it is below their radar, below their sensitivity threshold. And let me throw some numbers here so that we can understand. Most of these antigen tests that are available out there, they have a sensitivity threshold of about 100 to 200 picogram per ml. The assay that we develop, it has a sensitivity of about 0.1 to 0.2 picogram per ml. So if you think about it, we have at least 500 times lower sensitivity, which means higher sensitivity, which means that we can detect 500 times lower amount of the virus. Is this important? Of course, it depends on the question that you want to ask.
Sorry, 500 times more efficacy, is that what you're saying?
More sensitive, which means that we can detect 500 times lower amounts of the virus compared to what the classic approved antigen assays can measure.
So that's interesting, because I had not understood that the PCR test was that inefficacious. I had heard.
I'm not comparing this, Brian, this is important. I'm not comparing this to PCR now. I'm comparing this to the lateral flow assays. Have you seen, maybe you have seen this at home, direct to consumer, exactly. So there are some of these tests that are available, that are approved even by Health Canada. They have not been used massively yet. I think that there is a reason to use these tests, and I'm a big fan of using them massively, but they cannot be really reliable tools as medical diagnostics. They are very good tools just from a population public health point of view. So the difference between these two is that both of them are antigen detecting assays, but our testing is very, very sensitive. Of course, this comes at a small cost, and the cost is not only monetary. The cost is that this other test can happen in half an hour. The more sensitive test that we are making, it requires at its current format 3-4 hours before the full assay is completed. The other thing is that our test, in theory, it could be slightly more costly than these lower sensitivity assays, but it's going to give you a higher sense of confidence.
Well, if it's 500 times better, it probably should cost a little bit more.
Yes, but we're not talking for a different order of magnitude cost. There is no price there altogether until now, but I'm sure it's going to be on par, maybe.
Okay, but the bigger issue is this time. And I think people frustration, that they send the test away and they don't hear for 48 hours, 72 hours. The first test I didn't hear back for almost a week.
Same for me, Brian, and I couldn't believe it, and I still cannot believe it, that we are 1 year into the pandemic, and there is such a huge informational gap in terms of the diagnostics and in terms of the ability of the people to know their status. And this is, I think, the biggest advantage of this thing is that if you decentralize this thing, and if you manage to operate this properly, you can have within 12 hours back in your cell phone, and this is what we are working for, from the time that you spin in the tube, in 12 hours, to have back your infectious status sent to you in your app, and then you are quite confident. Now, remember, there is not such a thing as 100% reliable, but you're going to be quite confident.
Does it get mailed away to a central lab, or what happens?
So there are two ways to approach this. And this is some things that while we're designing now our larger validation study, we are discussing with some local partners, and there is an interest on how to push this forward. And the ideas that I hear is that both of a central lab that you can speed your tube, put it in your postal box. This will immediately come very fast to the central facility in Toronto, and then you get your data back. The other idea is also because the size of the machine that we are using is not bigger than, let's say, a printer from the 90s. So if you have a vehicle that you can use, and especially for standard locations, this can be even done on a vehicle-based facility. It depends on what is the demand, and it depends on what is eventually your go-to-market strategy. And there are different ways to think about this. One way is to think that, for example, let's imagine a scenario that someone has a big factory of processing food or of any other industry-related topic, that you have many people gathering together into the same enclosed facility. So maybe for them, it would make sense to invest some money in order every Monday to have all their employees, before they go to work, to spit into this barcoded tube. The truck can do the analysis, or this can come directly to the central lab. Right. In a few hours, you're going to have your status. If someone is positive, you go home. If someone is negative, you don't take your mask out, but you are much more confident that your chances of having a local outbreak in your company is already reduced a lot.
But how quickly are you getting this result?
In a few hours. So what we are working to now is the actual.
But in that time of the few hours, the employee has been at work and they've infected a bunch of people.
Well, there is a risk, but you're going to have one person for a few hours with an unknown status versus having all people for all the time on an unknown status. So there is not such a thing as 100% safety, but you're going, yes, to have some relative risk in the first few hours, a risk that you would otherwise have throughout the week. But for the rest of the week, you're going to be much more safe, much safer in terms of the chance of having a local outbreak. That's one way that this test can be applied. The other way is, I think, direct to consumer. And personally, I find it really surprising to say that after 1 year in Canada, my only option right now to know my status or infectivity status is to go and wait in the COVID medical centers, which they are doing a great job. But for many reasons, people really don't want to go there.
When I came back from the United States back in March, April of last year, I had some symptoms. I spoke with a physician and said, don't go get tested. You've got a bigger risk of getting the disease, the virus, if you go to the hospital at the time. Now, that was before
there are many reasons. People hate going to the hospitals, let's be honest. And especially these days, they hate it even more. So I think that eventually, if I had a way to just from home, just spit in a tube, put it in my postal box, and tomorrow get my results back, of course, this would not enable me to go against any of the measures that is allowed. But it is something that will going to make me, my in-laws that are part of our bubble, everybody, my daughter that comes from school, everybody to know that we are walking on a safer line here, because in general, we have decided that we are going to try to avoid getting infected until we get the vaccines.
Right. Well, that's a huge issue. So it gets sent away to a central lab, and then you get the result back in a couple of hours. Tell me about sort of positive, whether false positives, false negatives.
Yes, I will tell you this thing. Right now, the assay is not like a couple of hours. It's about 3-4 hours for the assay time. And then that's why we are now we believe that at the current status, we can have at about 12 hours back the results. But our ongoing work is to reduce the assay time significantly. Now, the important thing is that we can measure thousands of samples per day, because for the first batch, let's say for the first plate, for the first 100 samples, it takes 4 hours. But then with a one machine and one operator, you can measure one new plate, which is 100 more samples every 10 minutes. So the throughput that you can achieve is very high if there is demand and you want to just have more and more people screened. So that's one advantage of this thing. It can easily be scaled and
easily be scaled and higher throughput.
Exactly. And the other thing is that there is a moral thing. Someone may say, why don't you just try to take a PCR and do the same thing that the government is doing? There is a small of a moral thing here. You don't want to compete with resources that the established health system is using. We know that there are times that the supply, there is so much delays and there is so much problems with supply issues that you really don't want to capitalize on competing using similar technology that requires similar limited supply reagents with the health system. So offering a complementary method that actually is not competing supply-wise with the central route of detection of COVID, I think is going to be favorably seen by everybody, because it's going to get some of the burden out of the established routes for COVID detection.
So tell me what the status is of your approval process and your testing.
So let me say, you asked before about sensitivity specificity. We have done a mini proof of concept assay, and is now pre-printed. And what we have seen in a small scale at 110 patients, we've seen that there is a 100% specificity in a small number of cases of non-COVID patients. None of them came positive, as expected, I would say. And there was very high sensitivity, more than 90% in cases of a true positive COVID. And the important thing is that our limit of detection for our assay, it is down to 4 viral copies per microliter, which is actually on complete par, if not lower, than the established PCR technologies. So we are very confident that these promising results are going to pan out in the new study that is now cooking. We're going to test this in about 500 saliva samples that we are collecting in collaboration with the microbiology lab at Sinai Health Systems. And the goal is that by May 1st, we want to have all the answers in the table that then would allow some commercialization activities to mature and push this out as fast as possible. We are not going to wait until then in order to start designing the commercialization strategies, but right now I cannot say much more about this until we have the clinical data available.
Well, it sounds like a fantastic progress that you've been making, and I think it could have a material impact. But, what about, are you too late? Is everyone going to be vaccinated and we're not going to have an issue? Actually, let's take a break and come back and address timing and those issues in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Ioannis Prasas, who is a staff scientist at Mount Sinai Hospital. He's got an incredible career historically of some of the work that he's been doing in proteomics and cell microbiology and other issues. And this is my second show with him. We talked about some of the work that he was doing on testing with COVID-19 a couple of months ago, but it sounds like they've made great progress. But Ioannis, you're talking about not getting the tests done to prove that you work by the end of May. I thought we were going to be all vaccinated by the summer, and so therefore, are you too late?
Well, it's never late. And let me say something, Brian. This is something that all of us were discussing, and I truly wish that we had these tools earlier available, because this would be a fantastic tool to help in the management of the pandemic. But let me just see how this fits into the big picture and why I think we should keep investing into this type of tools. I truly believe that there is a big information gap when it comes to understanding the immunological interplay of our systems with infections. And I think that traditionally, we did not have the technology cheap enough and throughput enough that would allow a more personalized approach in understanding what is the immunological status of certain individuals when it comes to certain pathogens. For example, right now, there is information in my blood and in your blood, Brian, that can be used to know what are the different pathogens that you have encountered in your life, against which pathogens you have active immunity, in which pathogens you have some weak immunity or strong immunity. And this information is something that can be used to tailor your next therapeutic steps in terms of prevention of the disease or even therapy of the disease. And for example, right now, in the absence of these tools, we are using these blanket strategies that everybody is going to get the same amount of vaccine at the same time points, but this is not really optimal. And we know that when we monitor now patients that are getting the vaccines, we can see that different individuals, they develop completely different titers of antibodies, and different people have very different duration when it comes to how fast their immunity is waning or not. So why I'm saying all these things? I think that we need to improve our information, and the information that we need in order to combat the future steps of the current pandemic and the next pandemics is going to be improved by tools like this. And these tools, for example, one is to find your infectious status. What I did not mention is that using the same machine, we are now also introducing a new assay, again in saliva, that is measuring the presence of antibodies against the three different viral proteins. By using these assays, you're going to be able to know what is your level of immunity. And this is something.
Oh, really? So this is not only a test of do you have the infection and are you infectious, but exactly. Did you have the infection and you're now immune?
Exactly. And this is unpublished data. Actually, we are preparing now the first preprint on this as well. So I think that in the next phase of the pandemic, more and more people are going to move their curiosity from, am I infectious or do I have the virus, to, am I still protected? And this is something that a lot of people are going to start wondering in order to to know and discuss with their physicians on what should I do about the next step of my vaccine. And I think that it is a good thing, and all this pressure should eventually materialize into a more personalized way of treating our build-up of immunity against the different pathogens. And that's why it's never late. Actually, it's the very beginning of having these tools.
Well, and I can see a situation where people want to go to a sporting event or a theatrical event, and you want to test them beforehand, or airplane travel or whatever.
Exactly. And there are a lot of movements. I was reading today that Pearson Airport is now trying to establish this type of screening. I think that in general, I find it almost ridiculous that we are taking our shoes off when we go to the airplanes, but we do not test for some of these very dangerous infectious diseases. And of course, it does not apply to a common cold virus, but when it comes to a dangerous pathogen, I think that in the future, we are going to need to do this type of screenings, and this should not be something that it should be difficult and make people difficult to comply with. This must be something that should be very easy, very simple. We do not want to make the life of people difficult. We want to make the life of people easier.
No question, I can see that. So this is a test that you're going to be testing in 500 people. You should have the results by the end of May. And then what do you have to do? Do you file it with Health Canada at that time?
Yes, actually, we are already discussing with some local partners that they have established licensed facilities to offer this type of testing, and they have already started the procedure of contacting Health Canada and trying to streamline the regulatory process. It entails some type of work, but because of the urgency of the situation, Health Canada is also providing some shortcuts with always respecting the science behind it. And
so there was a company last March that got Spartan Bioscience that got approval on a rapid test.
That's a fantastic test.
And then I guess something went wrong with it in implementation, and they had to take it off the market, and it was in 8 months or so before they got sort of reapproved. So yes, what happened there? Do you know?
I know the people in Spartan very well. I know the CEO. We have met a few times. We've talked. I really like their technology. And what has happened, there was an issue with the swabbing, if I recall correct, that they were using. It was not very compatible initially with the type of swabbing that must be used in order to have fair comparisons with the classic established molecular testing. All this is now solved, and I think that this is another situation in which a portable PCR machine can give an equivalent important set of data regarding your status or not. I think that we need more things like what the PCR Cube are doing in Spartan, what we are building. The more of these ideas are available, the cheaper and the more.
Was there something there that they got approved too quickly?
I do not know the details about it. I'm sorry. I knew them. I knew Spartan Bio from a few years ago. I've heard back in March that they approached Health Canada to get an approval. I thought that there was some issue and they had to withdraw.
Well, that's my only concern with the quick approval, is that you get approved, but then it's not as efficacious, or there's something wrong with it. Anyway, so if you get the positive results by the end of May, any idea how long the approval process will take and when you'll be on the market?
No, I think that the goal, from what I understand, is that actually the clinical validation is going to be done by mid-April. And the goal is that by May to start offering this thing through some research purposes only first, until you start getting a final approval that you can officially put it out. So there are different routes. Are you
going to launch it yourself, or are you going to license it to a company, or what?
I think that this is something that local partners would have to talk directly to the company that we're working with and with us, and this is going to be a three-way discussion on how to make this happen.
No, well, if you need any help on that regard, give me a call, because that's something I'm very interested in. So, listen, let's talk about some of the questions or myths that have come up about testing, both PCR as well as your test. Some of these people that are sort of anti-maskers, et cetera, have been criticizing the PCR test, saying that even if you get the common cold, you can test positive for the coronavirus with the PCR test. What do you say to that?
Well, it is completely nonsense. You cannot. There is some cross-reactivity that you can see with previous coronaviruses. For example, you may, not in terms of PCR, you may have some in the serological assays, if you have been infected with SARS-CoV-1, which is a few thousands people globally, you may have some cross-reactivity. But no, the question is that no PCR can give you a false positive because it cross-reacts with any other flu or any other common cold coronavirus. It is just wrong information.
Okay, the second claim I've heard is that the false positives and the false negatives are way too high, and so therefore it's not really terribly efficacious.
Well, no, I don't think. Let's take one by one. Let's talk about the false positives. False positives in terms of PCR testing is very low because it's such an ultra sensitive assay, similar to the assay that we are building, that it will catch almost everything. It is almost impossible to not to have lower than 4 viral copies per microliter if you do have the virus. So I think that false negatives is not going to be an issue. Now, for false positives, it's even lower when it comes to PCR testing. In order for there is some way that it could be a contamination from the swab, or it could be an error from the nurse or the clinician that is doing the test. But we're talking about a tiny minority of the cases. I think that overall PCR tests are very reliable. There is an issue, as I mentioned before, that not all positive tests mean that you are still in the infectious status, in the infectious stage of your disease. But this should not be translated no way that they are not reliable tools. Actually, they're very reliable tools, and that's why they're used as the gold standards.
So you're pretty happy that the PCR test is efficacious and effective, and yet at the same time people are saying we still haven't rolled it out nearly widely enough. What's happened there? Has that been just lack of manufacturing of the tests, or the cost, or the ability to manage the implementation of it? What do you think?
Yes, I think it's all of them, Brian. And when you depend only on one technology, and then you have, all of a sudden, you go from a demand that was 1 to 1 billion in a year, then of course you're going to run into supply limiting factors. And then this is what happens. And that's why you cannot really scale up these things, because I don't want to go into the details, but every single step, it is prone to the appropriate enzymes, to appropriate machines, to appropriate dyes, to appropriate. So this sets a limit on how much you can scale these things. And that's why we really need to find complementary technologies to really enhance, to make this information gap smaller.
So we've got the PCR test.
Yeah.
We've got your test that's going to be a saliva test. We've got the assay tests like the Spartan test that is I understand, an assay that goes into a cube on site.
Correct.
What other competitive tests or complementary tests?
Eventually, we're going to have also these do-it-yourself pregnancy-like tests, that it is less sensitive, but because they can be applied almost every day in a theoretical, let's do a theoretical exercise. If we could manufacture tons of them, and these are very easy to manufacture. You just take a piece of paper, you just drop it. It's very easy. You can really scale up manufacturing a lot. So if there was a true investment into manufacturing a lot of these pregnancy-like tests, even if you miss a lot of cases, if you test once, just by applying frequent testing using these suboptimal tests, you are going to really stop the transmission chains in your society.
And what are you dipping it in? Urine or saliva or what?
These are different ways. There is yet to see a saliva test. Most of them are using still a swab at home that you are putting it into a solution to extract whatever the swab has taken from your nose, and then you're using your at-home test, like a pregnancy test, to get 1 or 2 lines. So the
University of McMaster and University of Guelph have been supposedly, I understand, working on tests that go into sewage systems, and they can test whether it's within a community or a community, a residence block or something like that. So if they can do that, why can't we have a test like a urine test that we all do every year when we go for a health checkup?
We could. And I think that eventually we will. I think that eventually we're going to have a much closer surveillance system, both at a person level and at a city level. And I think that what you just mentioned, the shared surveillance and all this, is what I call peace times surveillance systems. When you're not at war and you don't really need to check everybody, you can just go and look at the shared system, and you can have an idea at the different parts of the city if there are local outbreaks and if you should intervene or not. There are actually some even more cool science projects now that have been funded in the States, that the goal is that in a few years, similar to how we predict and forecast the weather, but just by surveilling the blood from several people, we're going to be able to surveil the presence of different pathogens or of different immunological reactions at the society level.
So you think there's also a blood test that could be developed for COVID-19?
Yes, there will be. And I think that in the near future, our understanding and our surveillance capacity for the different viral infections is going to increase drastically.
Well, I guess, that's a topic I'd like to come back to after a break and ask you. You had mentioned that this, you don't think it's going to be too late, but also you think it's going to be very helpful for the next pandemic. And you talk about peacetime surveillance when we're not in war. So what I guess you're suggesting or concerned about is that we're going to have another pandemic. And I want to take a break for some messages and come back more with Ioannis Prasas and ask him about whether we're going to have to go through all this all over again. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio, or Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Ioannis Prasas, who is a laboratory specialist at Mount Sinai University, and it sounds like he's got just an unbelievable pedigree. Ioannis, tell us, you got your Bachelor's of Science in Greece. Where was the university? And was it in Athens?
It is in Alexandroupolis. So Alexandroupolis is a beautiful town in the northeast side of Greece. So
fantastic.
I finished the Department of Molecular Biology and Genetics, and then I came to Canada for my PhD, and still I'm here, and I'm really grateful for being here. I'm really grateful to Canada.
And tell us what was the sort of the title of your thesis or your research question?
So most of the times I was always interested to understand the mechanism of action of different drugs. That's why when I did my PhD, I was trying to find ways to repurpose previously known drugs for novel applications just by knowing how they work at a molecular level. And I think that this is what is still my number one curiosity, to understand how drugs or viruses or life, how it works at a molecular level. And I think that being a molecular biologist has been I was very lucky. I did not know that's going to be so fun and so exciting to work into this part of science.
Well, given the progress that you're making on this current test, we're very thankful that you stayed in Canada and that you're doing this very valuable work. But you concern me. You said that this could get us ready, helpful for the next pandemic. So do you think we're going to have another pandemic? I thought this was like a once in 100-year pandemic. It happened in 1918, 1919 with the Spanish flu, and it happened in the Middle Ages with the bubonic plague or whatever. You think it's going to come again?
Of course, it's going to come again. And it's not like 100-year thing. So we have the frequency of this thing coming, it is higher. And even though we managed to avoid, I think by a combination of serendipity and science in the past, we managed to avoid some of the more recent potentially pandemic situations with SARS, MERS, Ebola, and other cases. The more that we are growing into this planet, the more that we are interconnecting with each other, the more that we are increasing our points of connectivity with each other. It is all prognostic factors showing that we are the risk of getting another zoonotic event and capturing another virus from an animal somewhere in the planet and immediately passing it everywhere is growing and growing. And I think that this is the cost of coming together And this is the cost of breaking the barriers and making distances overcome.
So we had SARS in what was it, 2003, I think it was.
Exactly.
And we had a whole judicial commission afterwards that made a whole bunch of recommendations as to how we had to get ready for the next something or other. And yet I think we forgot about them. They talked about long-term care protections. They talked about having an inventory of masks. They talked of PPE. They had talked about an inventory of ventilators, and we didn't do any of that. Or when we did it, we didn't maintain it. So you think we got to be prepared?
Let me tell you, when I was a kid and I was playing very dangerous games like throwing and jumping from one wall to another, always I remember my parents telling me, be careful, you're going to get injured. I would ignore them. It was only until I broke my leg that I realized that, oh yeah, that's a danger here. And I think that we broke a leg here. It was very painful. And we're going to have a lot of the consequences of this pandemic, even though I believe that the more difficult turns of this pandemic are now behind us. And now we have the tools to put this into a control situation rather soon. I think that we are going to have a new pandemic coming, but I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic because right now we have been alarmed enough and science is now on top of things. Everybody's wondering now and everybody's worrying about the mutations of the virus and the variants that we see. And I say, sure, viruses could appear smart, even though everything happens by chance, but science is smarter. And I think that in the end of the day, now that this coronavirus has really poked our egos, the scientific egos, I think it is about time to put in place all the measures that should have been there, but it never really happened because we never injured enough. We're never injured enough. And
you made the comment about we have to take our shoes off at the airport. And after 9/11, we did invest a huge amount of money and hassle in security. And so, if you think that there's another virus pandemic or whatever coming, then I agree with you that we should be doing the appropriate things to protect ourselves.
We will, and even if this entails that at some point, initially, we may do some exaggerations, it is all good. Eventually, we're going to find this new balance point that is going to enable us to move safer in the future without the risk of having a new pandemic to come to us completely and find us completely unprepared. I think that this is the last pandemic, at least in the next many years, I would say 50 years at least, before we forget how painful a pandemic could be. And I think that once we put these technologies in place, they will be there to stay. So with this in mind, and with also knowing that there are some more aggressive ideas about, for example, the development of pan-coronavirus or pan-influenza vaccines, and I truly believe that in the next few years, we're going to really reevaluate our total relationship with viruses and the future. If I were to bet science versus virus, I would so bet for science right now. Viruses have gone a bit too far and now it's going to turn against them.
Ioannis Prasas, thank you so much for joining us. Staff scientist at Mount Sinai Hospital. Sounds like you're working on some pretty valuable things, and thank you for that. If people want to follow your progress, is there a website they can check you out at?
Sure, they can go to acdclab.org. This is the part of the official website of our lab, or it can just go on Twitter at Ioannis Prasas, and I try to post more and more of these ideas about where we stand and what's the next step of the pandemic.
Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck.
Thank you, Brian. Happy to be here. Thank you.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM, or you can stream me online at saga960am.ca, or all my podcasts and videocasts are on after the fact at briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.